Despite its notoriety for horrifying acts of torture and imprisonment, many of the tales about the happenings within the walls of the Tower of London have been greatly exaggerated over the years by those fascinated by dark and grim tales. However, the fortress's 1,000-year history still provides us with some events that are sinister enough to give credibility to the tower's reputation. This is the haunting history of the Tower of London. The beginning of what would become the infamous Tower of London was established by William the Conqueror shortly after his coronation on December 25, 1066. The first Norman king of England, now King William I, set out to build castles in the Norman tradition throughout the land not only to maintain control, but to serve as a symbol of power and dominance over his newly acquired subjects. The edge of the Thames River was selected as the location for one of the most important castles in English history. While the original structure was made of wood, work began around 1078 on a more permanent stone structure which would eventually become the central keep, known as the White Tower. It would take decades to build, and the resulting structure was a beast. Stone had been brought over from Normandy to build the impressive fortress, which rose 90 feet in the air and had walls 15 feet thick at their base. Over the years, monarchs would continue to expand the fortress, eventually adding lavish royal accommodations, a mint, an armory, a menagerie, and a jewel house where the crown jewels are still held to this day. However, the reputation the tower has today is largely due to the dark fate that many people were said to face once they entered the formidable structure as prisoners. But an exception to this destiny can be seen with the tower's very first prisoner. Since 1083, Ranulph Flambard had served under both King William I and his son, King William II. Under the elder, he served as Keeper of the Seal, and under the younger, he rose as high as Chief Minister, and even acted as regent in the king's absence. However, when William II died in battle, his younger brother, Henry I, took the throne and imprisoned Ranulph as a scapegoat for his brother's unpopularity. He became the tower's first prisoner on August 15, 1100. Ranulph spent 6 months in the White Tower before devising the tower's first escape plan. Ranulph, as well as many of the people of wealth and status who would follow him, retained great privileges while imprisoned at the tower. He had enough means and freedom to throw the tower guards a banquet in early 1101. Any successful medieval banquet requires barrels of wine, so Ranulph ordered several for the special event. Hidden in one of the barrels was a rope Ranulph had smuggled in. As the guards made merry and drank their bottomless wine, Ranulph used the rope to escape out of a window, met a boat he had arranged to wait for him, and made his way to Normandy. While Ranulph successfully became both the tower's first prisoner and first escapee, many more people, from commoners to royals, would enter its thick walls over the next 800 years, and some were not so lucky. The Tower of London has a reputation for torture and imprisonment that stems from the Tudor period in the 16th and 17th century. During this time, physical torture methods such as the rack or manacles were used. However, there are records of just 48 people being subjected to such horrific treatment. Indubitably, many others endured immense psychological torture while imprisoned. But it is the grim executions that took place at the tower, especially those of notable people, that seem to capture the most attention. Some of the most famous executions were those of not one, not two, but 3 queens who were all beheaded on the Tower Green. The first of which was Anne Boleyn, second wife to King Henry VIII. Anne's time as queen both began and came to a swift end at the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn was the granddaughter of one of the most powerful men in England and spent many of her adolescent years in the French court. In 1522, she returned to England and became a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, Catherine of Aragon. Anne began to draw attention from many admirers in the English court, including Henry VIII, who was known to have mistresses, including Anne's own sister. Henry had become increasingly unhappy with his first wife, Catherine, who, despite giving birth to 6 children, produced no surviving sons. Ever desperate to secure a male heir and now infatuated by Anne, Henry made a case to the Pope in 1527 stating that because Catherine was his brother's widow when he married her, their union was a sin and should be annulled. The Pope would not answer him for many years, but ultimately refused the king's request. Not happy with this decision, Henry took matters into his own hands. In January 1533, Henry and Anne married. Henry's marriage to Catherine hadn't officially ended, so he was technically married to both women for a few months. In preparation for Anne's coronation in June, Henry made sure the royal apartment at the Tower of London was fit for his new queen for her customary stay before the event. The coronation was quite the lavish ordeal. Anne soon gave birth to a child, but much to the disappointment of Henry, it was a daughter, Elizabeth I. Just 3 short years later, Anne would return to the Tower of London and would stay in the very same accommodations. However, this time she came by boat through the notorious Traitor's Gate on charges of adultery involving several men, including her own brother, and plotting to kill the king. The charges had been brought about by Thomas Cromwell in an attempt to get rid of Anne, who had become unpopular at court and rendered useless when she could not produce an heir. Many historians believe these charges were either exaggerated or entirely fabricated. Nevertheless, Anne stood trial and was unanimously found guilty. Just over 2 weeks after she entered the tower through the Traitor's Gate, Anne Boleyn was beheaded on top of Tower Green, by sword instead of axe, a request from Anne that the king obliged. Anne's death didn't seem to impact Henry much, as he married his third wife, Jane Seymour, 11 days later. The next queen to meet a quite similar fate was actually Anne's cousin, Catherine Howard. She became Henry's 5th wife. His third wife, Jane Seymour, died after giving birth to the male heir he so desired, and his 4th marriage to Anne of Cleves ended in divorce. It's said that Henry fell madly in love with the young Catherine, and he was keen to secure the heir and the spare by having another son. The two married in 1540, just weeks after the end of his last marriage, but this one too would also be short-lived. It's believed, though not proved, that less than 2 years into her marriage to Henry, Catherine rekindled things with the former lover, Thomas Culpeper. Henry then learned of Catherine's alleged premarital affairs with not only Culpeper, but with 2 other men. The king was irate that his new young bride was unchaste when they wed. Catherine was taken to the Tower of London, possibly passing the heads of her alleged former lovers on stakes along the London Bridge. The next day, Parliament passed a bill which made it treasonous for a woman who was not a virgin to marry the king. 2 days after that, Catherine was beheaded in the same spot her cousin Anne was 6 years earlier. Then came perhaps the saddest of the 3 queens, young Lady Jane Grey. Known as the 9-Day Queen, Jane's journey to the throne was carved out by exploitive, power-hungry men in her life. She was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII. As a child, Jane was sent to live with Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife who actually survived him. After Catherine's death, her then-husband Lord Thomas Seymour became responsible for Jane and arranged for her to marry her cousin King Edward VI, Henry VIII's son and successor, and Seymour's nephew. However, this road to queendom came to a swift end when Seymour was beheaded for treason before the marriage could happen. Jane returned to the care of her father and began spending time at the royal court. It was there that she'd meet the king's regent, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who would then become her father-in-law when her father married her off to the Duke's son. The Duke of Northumberland held great power as regent to teenage King Edward VI, who was stricken with a fatal case of tuberculosis. The Duke was able to convince the devoutly Protestant Edward to change the line of succession from his Catholic half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth to his Protestant cousin Jane and her male heirs. It's said that Jane fainted when she was first told the possibility of her becoming queen. Jane was proclaimed Queen of England just 4 days after Edward VI's death. At just 15 years old, Jane ruled for 9 short days before Queen Mary I, aka Bloody Mary, gained the throne when Jane relinquished it. Both Henry VIII's will and a previous act from Parliament proclaimed Mary the proper heir, and much of the public also supported her in taking the throne. Upon her dethroning, Jane was thrown in the Tower of London with her husband and father. Her father, ever the opportunist, even declared his support for Mary in an attempt to save himself, and he was pardoned shortly thereafter. Jane and her husband were charged with high treason, to which Jane pled guilty. She was sentenced to death, which was later suspended. However, her father got involved with a rebellion, and she was soon beheaded with her husband, and her father was not long after them. But perhaps the most tragic of the royal tales in the Tower of London is that of the two princes that would disappear from the tower under mysterious circumstances in 1483. In April of that year, King Edward IV died unexpectedly, leaving the throne to his 12-year-old son, Edward. The new King Edward V was placed under the protection of his father's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Edward's mother did not want the Duke to serve as her son's protector, and instead desired a regency council as she was aware of the Duke's great dislike for her and her supporters. But the young king's uncle was nonetheless instituted as Lord Protector as it was spelled out in his father's will. On his journey from home at Ludlow Castle to London, the young king was met by the Duke of Gloucester and escorted to the Tower of London, which was both a royal residence and a prison at the time. The now Queen Mother and the king's younger siblings took up refuge in Westminster Abbey. However, the Duke procured the king's younger brother, the Duke of York, who was also named Richard, from the abbey under the pretense that he was joining the king at the Tower of London in preparation for the coronation. The two would never leave the tower alive. As Lord Protector, the Duke was effectively head of government and swiftly cleared a path for himself to the throne. The Duke alleged that the king and his brother had no claim to the throne as their father, King Edward IV, had been contracted to marry another woman, making his marriage to their mother invalid and their birth illegitimate. His campaign worked, and in July 1483, the Duke of Gloucester was proclaimed King Richard III, just months after Edward's ascension. What allegedly happened next is famously detailed in Sir Thomas More's History of Richard III. In it, he claims that two men were sent into the young boy's chamber in what has now become known as the Bloody Tower. While they were sleeping, the men strangled them until they could no longer breathe, holding pillows over their mouths. The men put the boys' bodies out naked on the bed to be inspected and true death confirmed. They were then ordered to bury the boys at the stair foot, suitably deep in the ground, under a great heap of stones. In 1674, nearly 200 years later, alterations were being made to the tower, and skeletons of two children were discovered under the staircase in the White Tower. Many believed these skeletons belonged to the princes. The remains were moved to Westminster Abbey and placed in an urn in Henry VII's chapel by order of King Charles II. Written in Latin, the inscription on the urn states, "Here lie the relics of Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York, these brothers being confined in the Tower of London, and there stifled with pillows, were privately and meanly buried by the order of their perfidious uncle, Richard the Usurper." In 1933, the skeletons were exhumed again and examined. The examiners believed that the bodies belonged to boys approximately 12 and 10 years of age who had likely died in the summer of 1483, aligning with the boys' ages and the alleged timeline of their untimely demise. The remains were once again placed in the urn and resealed. In 2013, forensic tests were able to confirm that other remains which had been found belonged to Richard III. People began to wonder if forensic tests may also be used on the skeletons found in the tower to see if they do, in fact, belong to his nephews. But it appears that the Church of England, with the support from the Crown, have repeatedly refused to allow the testing. There is some debate to this day as to who was responsible for the murder of the two princes. While we'll likely never know the true villain, King Henry VII, amongst others, have been floated as possibilities. But Sir Thomas More, and famously Shakespeare, would have us believe that Richard III is to blame for the tragic end of his young nephews. Interestingly, after refusing to declare allegiance to the Act of Succession, More too would find himself in the Tower of London charged with high treason, of which he was found guilty. He was executed on July 6, 1535. While these dark events occurred centuries ago, the legacy still lives on in the lore of the tower. And if you're lucky, you may just receive a royal visit while at the tower, as the ghosts of Anne Boleyn and the two princes are said to still haunt the grounds to this day.